Thank you. And before we started, Hannah said, why do I have to go first? Why do I have to be the first one to go? And then she said, well, maybe because then it's over and I can relax. But it's actually for a different reason, because in the TSC community, it's so important for us to start remembering that you are the experts on TSC. And the stories are about your stories. So yes, I admit that I have technical expertise in TSC, but you have the lived expertise in TSC. And I think it's only when we put the two together that we really make progress. So you can listen a little bit to what I say, but listen more to what she says and to what all of you are saying in all your stories. So, and if we can bring things together today, that'll be great. Just to give me a sense of who's here, how many of you are mums and dads of, say, a young child, a preschooler? So some preschool parents. How many of you are parents of a school age, or let's say primary age child? How many of you are parents of a teenager? Good. How many of you are parents of an adult with TSC? How many of you live with TSC? Well, actually, live with TSC means you live with it in the family as well. How many of you actually have TSC? Okay, good. So we have a really nice mix. I'll try that. Hopefully there'll be something relevant to everyone. But I've also said to Helen, I'm happy just to chat to people in between. I'm not licensed to practice here, so I can't give you a consultation, but we can certainly have an informal conversation or chat and think out loud with one another. And then you can find the real doctors who are here, like Murray and others, who can steer you in the right direction. Or at least he's licensed, we think. Okay. So the first thing for me to do really is just to say greetings from Cape Town. This is a nice picture of Cape Town. How many of you have been to Cape Town? Wow, we could have had the meeting in Cape Town. Gosh. So greetings from my beautiful mountain, Table Mountain. In the middle, you can see the University of Cape Town. So that's our upper campus, where many of the basic sciences are. And right here in the front, on Rondebosch Common, that's where my Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry is. So this is where I'm based. And this is where we have a clinical program and also where all our research activities happen. And here you can see when you send me an email after today asking me for my slides or for papers or for doctors, this is where I'll be sitting. This is the view from my office towards one of our clinical buildings. We like having a site that doesn't look like a hospital, because I think most children I don't like to go to hospitals, and I'm a bloody doctor. Oh, apologies, I shouldn't swear, I'm being recorded. And so we really like the fact that it's natural and trees, and it feels like a friendly place. And as you heard, my TSC story started in this town. This is King's College in Cambridge. And I moved to England thinking I was just going to train quickly and go back to South Africa. But I then did a PhD, which was in fact in TSC. In the late 1990s I started, and then stayed on and had a clinical program and a research program on tuberous sclerosis. But I also do a lot of research on autism, and we also have an adolescent health program in South Africa now. TSC is a system that affects everything, or can affect everything in the body. Brain, you've already heard about epilepsy from Hannah. You've heard about epilepsy surgeries. Some people get SAGAs, many people get kidney things, many people have all sorts of other things involved. And so today, there will be some talks. So Murray is going to talk later about kidney disease, am I right, Murray? Or do you want to come and do my talk? We're going to have somebody talk about genetics, and are we going to have somebody, what else are we going to talk about? Neurology, so the epilepsy-related stuff. So we will cover a range of different topics today. But I'm specifically going to talk about the neuropsychiatric manifestations. Why? The reason is because, one, these are the things that most mums and dads and people who live with TSC tell us that these are the things that trouble them most. Even more than the epilepsy, even more than the kidney stuff, even more than the lung disease or skin stuff, whatever. And secondly, because these are the things that are often not picked up and often not treated. And that's why when I told Helen that I was going to be on sabbatical in Australia, and I heard New Zealand wasn't too far from Australia, even though I'd never been here before, I said, let's do something at least to start the conversation or have some of the conversation about these manifestations. Right, but I'm not going to do all the work today, so I need you to do some work with me. So let's start with a quiz. Okay, so here's my first question. What does TAND mean? Is it A, the Afrikaans word for a tooth? That's the language I speak. Is it B, the Austrian word for beautiful but useless? Or is it C, TSC-associated neuropsychiatric disorders? What do you think? C? Any other offers? Well, it's a trick question. It's all three of them. So it is indeed the Afrikaans word for a tooth. It's also the same in Dutch and Flemish. And I have an Austrian colleague who said that there is apparently an Austrian word, TAND, which means beautiful but useless. So we hope that our word TAND will not be beautiful but useless, actually. But it is also TSC-associated neuropsychiatric disorders. And I will come back to why we decided to make up this word and make up this term in a minute. Second question. When we surveyed people in the UK in 2010, so these were all people who were members of the British TS Association, people like you, how many of them do you think had any assessment or any treatment for any of these TAND manifestations? Do you think it was 18%, so very few, 38%, so few more, 68%, the majority? What do you think? A. Are you just being cynical? Are you trying to read my mind? But you're right, it was 18%. So fewer than 1 in 5 people with TSC ever had any kind of evaluation or treatment for any of their TSC-associated neuropsychiatric manifestations. Next question. Have any of you heard of the TSC study? TSC is a big international study that we're doing where we've identified more than 2,000 people with TSC in 31 countries around the world. Unfortunately, New Zealand wasn't included. It's a shame. But many countries, so we have over 2,000 people, and when we checked to see how many, at what age people with TSC were diagnosed in that study with autism, what do you think was the average age? Do you think it was 3 or 5 or 7? 5, yeah. So in clinical practice, we say we try to identify children by the age of 3 so that we can help them access early interventions. And I'll come back to talk about early interventions because they can be incredibly powerful for autism these days. And you're right, the answer was 7. Even though we know 50% of people with TSC are at risk of developing an autism spectrum disorder, it was only by 7 that kids were typically diagnosed. Yeah? Here's another question, and then I'll move on. Can we treat TAND? Hopefully. That's not an option. What do you think? Is that hopeful? Yes. Yeah. And I think if you take away nothing, every single thing that I talk about today, there are things we can do about it. Every bit. And the dilemma, as you've already heard, is that people don't often think about these things, and then they don't often do something about it. And so if we just move from thinking about it to doing something about it, we can really affect all sorts of changes for everybody who lives with TSC. So let's now come back to TAND. And what I'm going to do is just to tell you why we made it up, tell you a bit about the TAND checklist. You should all have a copy of the checklist in your pack. It's not necessary to look at it now, but we'll come back to it when we do the second bit of the talk. But given that I've just mentioned TAND checklist in your pack, everyone's grabbing their TAND checklist. That's fine. It's called Human Nature. And so in the first bit, I'm really just going to outline what we mean by TAND, the checklist, some bits of research that we're doing. And then in the second half of the talk, we'll come back to thinking, what can we do about some of these things? And that'll be much more of a conversation with you and with local people as well. Okay. Why did we make up the word? Well, you've already heard some of it. The first reason is apart from epilepsy and kidney and skin and all the other things, most people with TSC at some point in their life will have some of these TAND manifestations. Most people. So far in research, what we've counted is 90%. So that's pretty much everybody. And for many people, it can be something very particular, a specific thing that's a problem, and it can be a problem and affect their lives. I did some TAND talks in Australia as well. And there was a young man, young adult, and he said to me, do you know what? I really don't like it when people say that I'm mildly affected with TSC. Because to me, I'm severely affected. Because that thing that has troubled me has caused me difficulties. And so I said to him, do you know what? I will never use the word mildly affected again. Because all of us have our need, and it feels kind of unfair to say you're mildly affected and you're severely affected. It works like that in funding too, doesn't it? If you have only a mild problem, you don't get money, but you have to have a severe problem. It doesn't make sense to me, but anyway. So most people have it. You've already heard, most people don't ever get any assessment and treatment for it. And the third reason why we decided to make up this term is because families, doctors in different countries, different kind of specialists use different terms when they talk about all these kind of things. I'm going to show you some of these words, and I bet you will all have heard some of these words spoken by people. Look at those words: cognitive, cognition, behavior, neurobehavior, neurocognition. I get confused even when I get to the number 4. Psychiatric, mental health, neuropsychological. Have you heard these kinds of terms? Have people used them for you and for your family? Yeah? Leah, you can't, can you see? You look into this thing. Okay, fine. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. And the last one, mental retardation, nobody should ever use again, right? That's a term that we are banning, have banned, in fact, some time ago. And that means people might use the same term to talk about different things, or different terms to talk about the same thing. And that confused families and people who live with TSC. That confused doctors trying to talk to one another, or clinicians. Or when I try to talk to the school system and they use different language from me, that made it really hard. And so that's why we decided to make up a standard set of terms to use in tuberous sclerosis. And that was why we came up with this term, TAND. In fact, we borrowed the idea from the HIV communities. You know, in Africa, we have very high rates of HIV. South Africa is the 4th country that has the 4th highest rate of HIV in the world still. And in HIV, what happened was people got very good at treating the physical manifestations of HIV, but they never thought about all the neuropsychiatric manifestations, because many people with HIV have all sorts of learning-related and memory and other problems. And so they invented the term HAND for HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders. And so we said, we're going to borrow that and use TAND. And in fact, now I hear that there are other syndromes who are going to use something. So Fragile X are going to use something like FXAND or something like that as well. And what we said is that TAND is an umbrella term to capture all the different levels of neuropsychiatric manifestations that people might have at some point in their life. You're very welcome to take a picture of the umbrella. I like it. I think it's very nice. It's the only way I remember it. But the papers are also free. So you can look for, and I can make sure that Helen has links to these papers so that you can download them. We specifically made them free and open so that anybody in the world can access it, so that you don't have to be in a university or registered at this particular journal to be able to access it. And what we're saying is that there are different levels of manifestations that everybody with TSC is at risk of, and what we should do is to look for them, and I'll go into more detail in a minute. What I'm going to do now is just to walk you through each of these levels: the behavioral level, the psychiatric level, the intellectual level, the academic level, the neuropsychological level, and the psychosocial level. And then I'll just give you some examples of what we mean by that and what the kinds of difficulties are at each of those particular levels. Right, let's start with the first one. So the behavioral level. People often want to make a big thing about the behavioral level, but it's simply the kinds of things that you are worried about for yourself or for your child. He doesn't sleep. He's not yet toilet trained. He doesn't speak. He struggles with this. He's not so good at maths. He gets anxious. She gets overwhelmed in crowds. You know, those are the behavioral challenges that any of us might say, I'm worried about. And that's why we go to doctors and school people and psychologists, etc. And we can test it with all sorts of different screening tools and measures, but that's the beginning of the process for our evaluation and planning rather than the end. Sometimes people say somebody has a behavioral disorder. I don't know what that means, actually, because behaviors should be taken further. We should understand what they mean, and we'll come back to talk about that later as well. In TSC, we can see almost anything. Lots of aggressive behavior, lots of anxiety, lots of language communication, getting on with people socially, difficulties, etc., etc. So there are many typical things, behaviors that we see commonly in people with TSC. Some of those things are more common when you have epilepsy or don't have epilepsy, but even people who've never had seizures have difficulties with many of these things: anxiety, learning, socializing, etc. The next level is this, what we call the psychiatric level. So this is when we're now going to say, a psychologist or a psychiatrist will say, are there enough of these things to meet criteria for a disorder? That's often why you hear people say he has autistic characteristics or traits but doesn't meet criteria. And mums and dads are confused, and sometimes I get confused too. But to say that somebody has autism, we need to say that they have enough of these and enough of those for long enough of this and excluding that. So there's a process by which we get to a diagnosis of autism, of ADHD, of anxiety, of depression, or whatever it might be. And in TSC, there are two main groups of psychiatric difficulties that we would see. Firstly, what we call neurodevelopmental disorders, and in that group, autism and autism spectrum disorder is the most prominent one. When we did some studies, close to half of people with TSC will meet criteria. It was around 40%. Will meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder as we define it now in our new diagnostic systems. And that's very high. And studies that colleagues have done in the US recently show that even in the first 12 months of life, we can identify people who are at risk of autism with TSC. And yet, what did I say? Age 7 is when kids with TSC are typically diagnosed. So that doesn't make sense to me. In fact, we had a conversation last week in Australia. I think if you have a 50-50 chance of developing autism or intellectual disability or something, I think everybody should start early intervention. Don't you think? Why do we wait for a diagnosis? Because you know how hard it can be to get a diagnosis. I think there are all sorts of things we should just do that will help all children develop and empower families to do so. But maybe we shouldn't record that bit. Too late. The second diagnosis that's very common is ADHD, or ADHD-like, because sometimes kids with TSC, you'll see later, it's not quite ADHD. But that's very common. But interestingly, we did a study in the UK, and I identified, in a systematic way, did assessments on kids, and found that 55% of them met criteria for ADHD. And of all the children in the study, only one had ever been diagnosed and treated for it. Only one. Yeah? So people don't look for it and therefore don't treat it. The other main group, and this is particularly so, and we start to see it particularly in the kind of early teen years and into adulthood, are anxiety disorders and depressive disorders. Anxiety in particular. So again, colleagues in Cardiff did a study in Wales. New Zealand reminds me a bit of Wales, actually. You have such a beautiful country. Colleagues in Cardiff did a study of adults with TSC who all had entirely normal intellectual ability and found that 60% of them met criteria for an anxiety disorder, and 0 had received a diagnosis or treatment. Not one. Yeah? Can you see why I'm as puzzled as your faces are as I look at you? And we can talk later about why that might be, but I think often people, we use the term diagnostic overshadowing. So often people see the TSC and they don't think that you can have TSC plus something. They just say, oh, that's just the TSC. And that then makes it impossible to treat just the TSC. Well, actually now we can do all sorts of things. And similarly, when people have intellectual disability, often people say, oh, that's just the intellectual disability, and they don't look for additional things that can be treated. And I'll come back to that. The third level, I've just hinted at that, is the intellectual level. It's different from the other ones, and that's when we measure people's IQ. Have any of you had an IQ test? Yeah? Did you pass? So, IQ tests are things that basically put us all on some kind of a normal distribution. So that, like, we call it a bell-shaped curve. You can see it looks a little bit like a bell. An average, it's a bit like our height. You know, if we put all of us together, most of us would have an average height. Some would be very tall and some would be very short. It's just an average thing. And an average IQ is 100, and then some people are higher and some people are lower. And by definition, if you fall below that number 70 and you have evidence of impairment in your daily life, you have intellectual disability. So in TSC, we see an interesting pattern. About half of people have entirely normal intellectual ability, and the other half have some degree of intellectual disability. And people are very interested in saying, can we predict where you will fall? But the more important thing, I think, is most people with TSC will have a very uneven profile of intellectual profiles. And so you will see that people have some incredible skills and then some real troughs, some real dips. And often when people just add up scores on an IQ type test, it doesn't tell us much. It's really about saying, well, my profile is like this, so I need to figure out what the top ones are, and I need to think what I can do to help build up the bottom ones. Otherwise, we're not really understanding somebody's intellectual profile well. And I think that's an important thing. The second thing for mums and dads is the numbers on an IQ score is only a tiny little piece of the story. You know, we often get an IQ result back and say, well, your child falls in the bottom 2%, so 98 other kids will do better than him. In the bottom 1%, so 99 kids will do better. It doesn't tell us really very much about the child, their skills, their interests, their abilities, their functioning. So take it if people use it, and it can be useful, particularly if it can give you access to services and money. Again, I'm saying all sorts of things that I should know are being recorded. But we need to be careful not to put too much in the basket of intellectual ability assessments. Next level, the academic level. So this is when we're going to think about school stuff, reading, writing, spelling, maths, etc. Anyone here had difficulties with maths? Maths is the most common specific learning disorder in people with TSC. Don't know why? If anything is going to be difficult, it's going to be maths. Isn't that interesting? For many people, it's helpful. Sometimes it's a little scary when I talk about these things, but sometimes people go, that makes sense. You know, I'm now not the only one who struggled with this thing or that thing. So there's something about just understanding that this is part of the profile that many people with TSC live with. And I think that's important. We'll come back to what we're going to do about that in a minute. And we asked, in this big Tosca study of over 2,000 people, we asked how many people had academic difficulties. And you can see it was almost 60%. The majority of people with TSC, children, adults, had or have some specific learning disorders. And many people struggle to get extra support in school, extra accommodations in school, additional support to develop those skills. It's an important, different level from the others because you can have an IQ that's super high and yet have a specific difficulty in your learning. And that's why it's important to look for it and to do something about that specifically. Next level, are you starting to glaze over yet? Not yet, almost, okay. The neuropsychological level. The easiest way to explain this is as our brains, the amazing brains that we have, grow up, they start to specialize to do specific jobs in particular bits of the brain. And that's just to make the brain more efficient. I mean, we need the whole brain. We can't just function with a little box here. But certain things become specialized in certain parts of the brain. So language, most of us, our language skills become specialized on the left side. And things like concentrating, attending is kind of a right-sided network. And doing puzzles and shapes and things like that tends to be a right-sided skill. The back of our brains, typically, is where all the knowledge is. I think of the back of my brain as my library. And then the front is the bit of the brain that does the job, but it needs to do the functioning. It needs to kind of get it out in some way. So maybe the front is the librarian, I don't know. But that's also why, because our brain specializes in different things, that's also why sometimes we have this tip of the tongue thing. You know, I know it, but I can't get it out. Does that happen to you? Yeah? The kind of, I'll come back to you. And then it comes. Because the front of your brain is the executive system, needs to get that information, and sometimes it gets a bit stuck. And people like clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists, sometimes some other professionals, depending on your country, I think in some countries occupational therapists can also do some of these tests. I'm looking towards Lisa now. I don't know what the situation is in New Zealand or who does it, but people can do a range of different games, puzzles, tests and things to evaluate your brain's profile of where are your strengths and where are your weaknesses in terms of memory, attention, language, spatial things, etc. And many people with TSC, in fact, I would say the majority of people with TSC, even those with completely normal intellectual ability, have some specific areas of weaknesses in their neuropsychological skills. And I'll just give you a few examples. One is many people with TSC struggle with memory. And the particular bit of memory that's hard for many people is what we call recall memory. So if I said to you, which of these two have you seen before? That's not recall, that's recognition memory. That's relatively easy for most people. That one, not that one. But if I say to you, can you tell me this thing? And you have to produce it, then that's hard for many people with TSC. And there are particular things we can do to evaluate that recalling information. The second thing is many people with TSC struggle with their executive skills. So that's planning things, organizing things, tracking what they're doing, and so they might get a little bit distracted or lost. Another very important one is what we call cognitive flexibility. So many people with TSC, when they try something and they try a plan, and it works, it's fine, and then next time, if they try the same plan and it doesn't work, they kind of get stuck. And it's hard to kind of shift to something else or to move to something that may be a different attempt, a different approach to this thing. And that can cause a lot of difficulty and a lot of anxiety and, for many people with TSC. I had a young man in my clinic, and his IQ was very high, but he had a very specific difficulty in his cognitive flexibility. And that made him so overwhelmed and anxious in school that he was out of school for almost 3 years because of that one specific thing. And I'm perhaps saying it over and over again, but just to make the point that one specific weakness can really have an impact on your functional ability and on your life. Oh, here's our opportunity for distraction, people. Food. I can't compete with food. I can compete with lots of things, but not with food. So I thought, well, let's see if we can compete with food. The only way to compete with distraction is to make something else more important, right? Okay, I'm not going to show you pictures of food, but I'm going to make us do a little game. So I'm going to do one little brain test, just to give you a sense of how we might assess some of these things. So what I'm going to do, I don't know if it's big enough. Is it big enough? Can you all see those numbers? It's not an eye test, so I kept it simple. So you will see on the screen, I'm going to show you a whole row of numbers. And all I want you to do is with me, out loud, as fast as you can, as a group, read out the numbers. Okay, shall we practice with this one? Okay, are you ready? Go.
1, 2, 3, 1, 1.
Okay, but you need to do it like a good choir, all together. Okay, and go.
1, 2, 3, 1, 1.
Almost, and go.
1, 2, 3, 1, 1.
Like it. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a longer list. Are you ready? You're going to just read the numbers out. Okay? Are you ready? Everyone ready? And go.
1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2.
That was pretty good. I didn't know New Zealanders can sing so well. That's good. I know you can play a bit of rugby, but I didn't know about the singing. Okay, so you will have seen numbers 1s and 2s, okay? You've read them. Cool. What I want you to do now, I'm going to show you the same list, but when you see a 1, I want you to say 2, and when you see a 2, I want you to say 1. Okay? Do you know what we're going to do? Are you ready? Ready? Okay. And go.
2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1.
Who got to the end? Okay. So why was this one a little harder? Why? Because what your brain wanted to do was the automatic thing, which was the reading. Because we've all been overtrained to read, yeah? And what you had to do was every time you had to say to your brain, no, not that one, the other one. No, not that one, the other one. So we call that response inhibition. And it's a test of a specific bit of brain functioning. And many people with TSC struggle with it, particularly when they're younger or when they have more broader intellectual disability. But it can be a problem for many people. So this is just, I mean, a neuropsychologist would never do it on a big screen in a room like this. That's just to wake you up and distract us from the food. I think we managed. That was good timing, wasn't it, actually? But that just illustrates to you that we can really tease out lots of different brain skills in interesting ways. And then think of strategies, if people struggle with it, what we can do to improve those particular brain skills as well. Okay, my level number 6. I've talked about behavioral, psychiatric, intellectual, academic, neuropsychological, and now psychosocial. The psychosocial level is an incredibly important one. It's almost one that kind of goes around all these other ones. Because this is where we think about, and you've already heard from Hannah, this is where we think about the impact of living with a chronic condition, of living with TSC, of living with a genetic disorder, of living with epilepsy, of living with whatever it is. And it's something you all know and experience, but it's something that doctors aren't always good at talking to people about. It's about the kind of the stress of living with it. It's about the shame. It's about the loss and the grief. It's about the struggles, the parental stress. TSC is associated with very, very high levels of stress between parents. Has all sorts of impacts on siblings and thinking, and mums and dads feeling guilty about the other kids, and it happens for everybody. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to make sure that we have this level is to acknowledge that this happens for everyone, and to give people an opportunity at least to think about it and to talk about it, and for doctors and other clinicians to say to people that this happens and to ask people what they're doing to manage and to cope. Because if you can't do this, the rest you can't really do either. So that's the umbrella. The different levels, typical common examples of these things. And the first recommendation, therefore, that we made when we came up with the guidelines in 2012 was we said that everybody with TSC should be screened for TAND at least once a year. And screening means a kind of a top-line checking. It's not a detailed evaluation or a detailed checking. It's like, let's see if there's any major area of concern, and then if we pick up a particular area, let's think in more detail what we can do about that. And mums and dads were happy when we said it, and most of the clinicians said to us, oh dear, we won't know what to do. Can you give us a tool? And that was the reason why we made up this thing called the TAND checklist. As a simple, structured, don't tell them, but we made it for the doctors because we knew that you already knew the answers, right? But a simple, systematic tool to give people all the things we've just talked about in a simple yes-no way, 2 pages, typically takes about 10 minutes. The first time it might take a bit longer, but really just as a check. Let's just do do you do like MOTs on cars in New Zealand? So this is like your MOT. Right? Are there flat tires? Is there anything obvious that we need to do something about? And then take next steps from that. And so we made up the TAND checklist. Again, it's free, it's open access. Anyone can use it. And we've done some work checking that it had the content that people needed, that it's clear, that it's accurate, that it measures up well against other instruments, because we wanted one tool that anybody could use regardless of their age. I was even made by the team to make a little movie where and it's open access, so any one of you can show it to somebody if you want to, if they need it, where I just interviewed a mum in Cape Town who had I think she had a 6-year-old with TSC, just to illustrate how one might use the simple pen and paper tool to guide thinking and planning in TSC. And we've by now, I think, so these are some of the language translations. I think we've translated, we're at about language number 15. And I think it's very helpful, just a simple translation, and there's a process by which we do it with families, and parent organizations. We always have clinicians and parent organizations together, because we want to make sure it makes sense to you, and we need to make sure that there are some professionals involved so that they will actually use it once we've done the job. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation we make about TAND is we then say each person with TSC should have a more detailed evaluation at key time points in their development. So in the first 3 years of life, every child with TSC should have an evaluation so that we can get a sense of their baseline functioning, what they might need when they go to preschool, look for those early things like intellectual disability, autism, language delay, etc. Mac's going to burst his balloon soon. Then in the preschool years, it's important to do it again, because remember, like all the physical manifestations of TSC, TAND manifestations change over time as well. And if you evaluate now, the profile might be different to 3 years' time or 6 years' time. So that's why we need to keep on doing it. Preschool years to plan for school and to do early interventions, depending on what's needed. Then in the primary years, because that's often when many of these scholastic, these specific learning disorders come online, when ADHD often comes online, etc. Then in the teenage years, because by teenage years is often when we see these additional things like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, etc. And sometimes things that had never been diagnosed before also become clear in teenage years. Often people are worried about teenage years, it's going to be terrible for everyone. It doesn't have to be. Often we just see clearly many of the manifestations that were sort of coming a little bit online anyway. And because in teen years the structure tends to get a little bit less, they might be more prominent. And then, of course, the other really important group is in many countries, and we talked about that yesterday as well, in many countries around the world, people have relatively good services until 18, and then once you leave school, once you're an adult, services for adults really tend to be very minimal. And so so we're recommending an assessment and evaluation in early adulthood just to help plan occupational things, independent living things, whatever that might be for people. Some people need a lot, some people need very little, but it's just important to make a plan so that we know in case things might be required. And everything takes time, so it's better to plan in advance. The third recommendation is one of urgent review. And it's very important for all of us to remember that when behavioral, psychiatric, any of these kind of TAND manifestations change suddenly over the course of a few weeks or a few months, unexpected, and this is where you are the experts. You will know, is this different for my child to what I'm used to? And then that's the point at which we need to do an urgent reassessment of physical presentation to think, one, might this be a growing SAGA? You know that people with TSC are at risk of growing tumors in the brain. And the first manifestation of a SAGA can be irritability, aggressive behavior, out of character behavior, changes in ability to learn, and those kind of things. Sleep, change in seizures. Seizures can themselves cause some of these things. And you heard beautifully from Hannah that medications in themselves, sometimes the medications to treat the epilepsy can bring some side effects that have TAND impact. Irritability, restlessness, being overwhelmed, being dysregulated, any of those kind of things. So that's then, when it suddenly changes, when somebody who used to be interested in, what are Ravi's interests that you say?
Sensory toys.
All these sensory. If suddenly he's no longer interested in all these sensory toys and he doesn't find pleasure in it, you're going to think, this is different from the Ravi I know. Another example I gave is I had a 15-year-old in the clinic who was doing absolutely fine in school, mainstream school, and he suddenly started to become very aggressive, started kind of chatting back to the teacher, then swearing at the teacher, and one day he actually kicked the teacher, and so he was kicked out of school. And mum and dad said, but this is not the son we know. And when we did an urgent workup on him, he had a SAGA that had started to grow, and these were manifestations of the SAGA, not of some psychiatric or mental health condition. So the treatment at that time, that was before mTOR inhibitors, was surgery, and he was able to go back to being in mainstream school after that. So that's why this is a really important third step for us to bear in mind. So let me just say a little bit about some of the TAND research we're doing, just to give you a sense of where some of the work is going. The first is, and I'm just giving two examples. The first is, can we find natural clusters of TAND manifestations? By that we mean many people, you live with TSC, so you are all expert at it and read about it and understand it. But many people are quite overwhelmed when we say each person in the room with TSC have their own unique profile. On the one hand, that's good because we are all unique. But doctors and clinical teams get really overwhelmed when we say everyone is unique. They go, well, then I don't know what to do and I'm just going to do nothing. And so from other examples of conditions and disorders, we actually wondered, can we find a few natural clusters of TAND manifestations, that if we can find them, maybe that'll make it easier for people to say, look for this and treat this. And we hoped that we could find fewer than 10 clusters because we hoped that most doctors can count to 10, right? So what we did, and in fact this is one of my PhD students, Lauren. Here, this is just like a visual example. So you can't see the detail of it at the back, but if you imagine each column is somebody with TSC, and each row, or the rows down, are the kind of items on the TAND checklist. And so if it's red, it means it's a problem, and if it's green, it means it's not a problem. And you can see, these were 20 people with TSC, and they all seem to have different patterns, different profiles. And we tried to see, can we find specific patterns? Maybe, maybe some of them have lots of reds, and maybe some of them have lots of greens, but we couldn't, with our eyes, we couldn't, and clinically, we couldn't really see specific patterns. But there are now, these days, there are ways in which we can actually do what we call cluster analysis. So we can use computer programs to look for patterns that our eyes can't see. And so what Lauren did, she actually took the data from people with TSC. We started with about 60 people just to see can the methods work. And she found 6 clusters of TAND manifestations. And so that was encouraging for us to take it to a next step and to a larger step. And so then we went to just under 500 people with TSC, had them all do a TAND checklist in America, Europe, South Africa, Australia. Next time we can include New Zealand. And did exactly the same kind of procedures. And what we found was, let me just get back. We found 7 clusters. So I'm just going to tell you, and we've now replicated in using some other data, so it really looks as though there are about 7 natural groupings of things that come together. So each one of us are at risk of having one or more of these clusters. So this is about an individual. So you can think, which of these clusters are mine? And somebody might have cluster 1, and somebody might have cluster 1 and 3, and somebody might have cluster 1, 3, and 5, and somebody might have a full house. But so here they are. So right on the bottom corner there is the scholastic cluster, reading, writing, spelling, maths. It comes out as a very distinct little group because it's separate from so many of the other things. Above it, overactivity, impulsivity, restlessness seems to be a cluster that many people with TSC have this very specific grouping of things. Then we see a very clear cluster for mood, anxiety, shyness, mood swings. So mood swings, many people think we see lots of bipolar disorder in TSC. I've not seen anyone with bipolar disorder, but we see lots of people with mood swings. So the kind of lability of mood. So that's a cluster. We have a clear cluster at the top of the blue of all these neuropsychological things, memory, attentional skills, those sorts of things. That's a very specific cluster. And then interestingly, a particular cluster around aggression and tantrums. That's a separate cluster. That's the cluster that most people come to me in the clinic for. And we'll talk a bit about that later. Then there's an eating and sleeping cluster. Interesting, Hannah talked about eating and sleeping. That's a little cluster. but you can see just kind of visually that that cluster talks to many of the other ones as well, but it's distinct. And that what it tells us is you can have, when you have eating and sleeping problems, it can be linked to and associated with lots of other possible TAND manifestations. And then there's a big autism-related cluster. That orange one are all the autism-related things. Eye contact, peer difficulties, language development, repetitive behaviors, all those sorts of things are a cluster, but you can see it overlaps and it talks to many of the other clusters. But so what we're now trying to do is to say, we want doctors and we want teams and families to look for 7 groups of things, 7 clusters of manifestations. And then the next thing we want to do, and this is what families have asked us for, is can we come up with a toolkit for each of those clusters? So if you say, my child has cluster 1 or cluster 2 or cluster 3, what can we do as a next step for that specific cluster? It sounds more manageable, doesn't it? Rather than to say all this kind of unique stuff. I did a talk yesterday at the Wellington Regional Hospital, and people were very interested to say, well, does it also link to brain manifestations or genetic manifestations, these different clusters? And maybe it does. We haven't asked those questions, but the main reason we wanted to do it was to see how can we help people who live with TSC with these reduced clusters. The second question, which many people are interested in, you've heard, see, Hannah's, the TSC expert has already set the scene for all these conversations. mTOR inhibitors, everolimus, you've heard all heard about. The landscape for TSC treatment has been transformed by mTOR inhibitors. We can now treat SAGAs with mTOR inhibitors, kidney lesions with mTOR inhibitors, epilepsy in addition to standard treatments. The trial that we finished in 2016, almost 50% of people in the trial who'd already been treatment resistant, so they didn't respond to any of the treatment, epilepsy treatments. When we gave them everolimus in addition to their regular medication, almost half of them had more than 50% reduction in seizures. So the medication is now licensed for SAGA, for kidney, for epilepsy in many parts of the world. We see significant improvement. You heard about the topical rapamycin. The systemic, if you take the tablet, it'll also improve your skin. I was saying yesterday, I have a girl in the clinic in my clinic, who to this day believes that the tablets that she's taking, even though we prescribed it for her kidney and her brain, that was for her skin, because that's the thing that she saw change most significantly. And that's the thing that was most important to her as she was a late teenager in terms of her manifestations. And so we wanted to ask the question, can mTOR inhibitors also treat TAND manifestations, given that it's such an important thing? We had some theoretical reasons. Don't worry, I'm not going to overwhelm you with what... Do people know what this thing means? Come on, let's do a 1 minute intracellular signaling. So, you can all tell TSC1 and TSC2, right? 2 genes, they make 2 proteins. Okay, and here are the 2 proteins. Sorry, the cameraman has to go back. They form a complex inside every cell of our body. So these things happen. These are all the proteins. Proteins talk to one another by either stimulating the other protein or by inhibiting the other protein. And so here you can see, and I'm sure there'll be a genetics talk later that'll do the same again. So you can see the TSC1-2 proteins basically put the brakes on this guy called mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin. And that's why when people have, if you lose the TSC1 or the TSC2 because you have a mutation in the gene, we have too much of this going on. It becomes overactive. And that's why the mTOR inhibitors, they just put the brakes, they kind of dampen down the mTOR again. And that's why we use it for tumors, because this guy makes cells grow and proliferate. So that's why if we make this one go down, it makes tumors shrink. But over and above that, there are also lots of other jobs that these proteins do in terms of brain functioning. So how to form memories and make memories stick, how to make the white matter tracks in our brains, the kind of the connectors in different bits of the brain, how to make the brain develop. And so the theory we had was that just disrupting that might be enough to lead to many TAND manifestations. And so maybe, therefore, if we can give people an mTOR inhibitor, it might improve some of those manifestations as well. And so far there's been I mean, there are a few studies happening. We've done two, one in the US, where we looked at 6 to 21-year-olds with TSC, and we gave them mTOR inhibitors and tested their memory and many of these things, parts of TAND that we've talked about. The study was 6 months long, and anybody could come into the study, and our findings were quite mixed. So some people got better, some people didn't get better, and so we really don't have a clear answer. We're still kind of looking at the data to see if we can make sense of the findings. And the second study is one we did with older people, 16 to 60-year-olds, and we learned from the first study and actually made sure that everyone had an IQ over 60, that people had very well-controlled epilepsy, and that each person who came into the study had a specific difficulty, a deficit in one of those neuropsychological skills that I mentioned to you. And what we found, and in fact, so far we only have the top-line findings, we just presented it 2 weeks ago in Japan. What we found was that, and I think it's very interesting, so we had a group of people who had a tablet that didn't contain everolimus, and then a group that had the everolimus. And in the group who had, call it a sugar tablet, 40% of people with TSC improved significantly in some of their performance on memory, on attention, on executive skills, on visuospatial skills. 40%. So that's very significant. And what that tells us is just the learning effect of becoming more familiar with the place, of knowing what to expect, knowing what to do, becoming less anxious in the environment is in itself a powerful tool to help us learn. It's so common that many people, particularly young adults, say to me, I go to new places and I just get overwhelmed the first time I'm there. So just helping people settle, familiar, predictable, etc., is in itself a tool to help us learn. So that's, I think, a really positive finding. And then what we saw in the group who had everolimus, we actually saw that 70% of them had improvements in their memory, learning, and the other aspects. So it does look as though over and above the learning effect, there is also a signal that everolimus does something to improve some TAND manifestations. So we still have a lot of work to do, but the good thing is that I think at least it tells us that the everolimus is not going to do harm to people's TAND manifestations. And many people who've been on mTOR inhibitors for their kidneys or their skin or their brain have said to us, I feel a little bit clearer. I think that my child is less anxious. But of course, those are anecdotal evidence. We don't know. And I think it would be really important for us as a next step to say, can we find evidence to use these treatments also to improve TAND? But I think before we go to any of these treatments, there are things we can do about all the manifestations we've talked about. And we'll talk more about them when we come back to the second session. So while we look for these kind of opportunities, there are opportunities in front of us that we should think about how we can use and access in terms of treatment of TAND. So this is what I wanted to do, why we came up with it, a bit about the checklist, a bit about where the research is going. We'll come back to treatment, and that'll be more of a discussion and a conversation with you. I don't know how we are for time, but if there's time for some questions now, we can do some questions. Otherwise, we can move on to the next one. Who are the bosses?
We've got 5 minutes.
We have 5 minutes. So if anyone would like to, based on what we've discussed so far, want to throw out a question or make a comment, please do.
Really interesting. He's been on topical, is it rapamycin?
Yeah.
For his skin, and just as you're saying about the reduction in what it can potentially have a roll-on effect,
Yeah.
We've pretty much been seizure-free for 2.5 years.
Okay.
And his seizures are generally hospital, respiratory arrest, helicopter material, like pretty severe. So it's been an excellent break, but just as you're speaking, I'm just putting it out there, is that having some effect?
So you're wondering, is it a coincidental thing, or could the topical rapamycin even have done something to his systemic epilepsy control? That's a really interesting observation. I don't know, because the technical answer I don't know is to what extent the rapamycin gets absorbed through the skin into the body. Theoretically, but sometimes what we see is we don't need very high doses of of something like everolimus in the system to target the TSC, because we know exactly what happens inside the cells of our body, and what we sometimes need to do is just to kind of turn the volume down a little bit. When we use mTOR inhibitors outside TSC, sometimes we have to use high doses, but sometimes in TSC it's just a tiny dose that's enough to shift things in that way. But as I said, we have good evidence that mTOR inhibitors improves seizures in a significant proportion of people who had really treatment-resistant epilepsy before that time.
I've got a daughter and an older son, and my wife's got TS as well. So just a question with regards to the whole TAND protocol and checklist stuff. So obviously you've mentioned about going through infancy and having the sort of the yearly stuff going and going through the different stages of life. Once you hit that part of early adulthood and going forward, what's sort of that recommendation from there going on? Would it still be regularly going through that TAND checklist, or what's that next phase from there?
Okay.
Have you guys looked into that?
So let's differentiate between screening and call it more deep dive, detailed assessment. So throughout our lives, we should have screening annually. So once a year, somebody should do something like the TAND checklist on everybody in your family who has TSC, because it means, you might not have an anxiety disorder now, but in a year or two, something might develop, or whatever other characteristic. So that should happen every year, all the time. You can imagine, as you do it every year, it becomes much faster to check through it and to say, has anything changed since last year? But then, the separate thing that I talked about, the early adulthood, is about a detailed assessment, where we really want somebody, and that usually means looking for a psychiatrist or a psychologist and some other people maybe, to say, let's look through all these things in much more detail than using a checklist, to see, might there be any of these things emerging? So early adulthood is the key one. After that, and we're busy revising the guidelines, what we're probably going to suggest is that after that, it should be for people who have intellectual disability, for somebody who has any degree of intellectual disability, probably every 5 years. But for people who have normal intellectual ability and don't have any obvious TAND problems at that stage, to do a more comprehensive assessment once the checklist or once your screening identifies a particular difficulty. Does that make sense? Okay.
The person doing the screening tool could be a GP or something, when it doesn't have to be a specialist. It's just your sort of lead carer.
So sometimes people think we made up the checklist for the psychiatrists and the psychologists who already know all these things. So it's not. It was because we know most people with TSC struggle to get access to any psychologist, any psychiatrist, any people who work with people with intellectual disabilities. And it's the same everywhere in the world. I was at the international conference in Japan, and I asked, how many of you, all the people sitting there, are mental health experts? And there was one apart from me. So even in highly, highly sophisticated countries like Japan, it's a problem. So we wanted to make this tool for GPs, for pediatricians, for even nephrologists, dermatologists, geneticists, anyone who works with people who have TSC, so that they can use it as a tool and you can use it as a tool. The next step we want to do in terms of research, and we're trying to get money for that at the moment, is we want to develop a self-report version. That's what families have asked us for. Give us one that we can complete ourselves, and preferably, if you can you do it in a way that we can do it on a tablet or on an iPad or on our cell phone or using technology, and that can then immediately give us tools of things what we can do next. So I can fill in my stuff and then it says, oh, you're at risk of this thing, do the following, or think about this, or go to this. So that's what you guys have asked us to do, and that's what we would like to do as a next step, but we'll just need to get the money. But I think while we try to find clinicians and doctors and psychologists and pediatricians who can work with us, I think the most important thing is to give you the power and the tools, because you're the people who live with it every day.
I've got TSC, and I was diagnosed back in about 1990, and I've tried the everolimus, and it didn't actually work for me, and I was just wondering whether in fact there were other things that were being developed for, it's probably not the right time to ask, to say shrink the tumours on kidneys and to help some of the other problems
Okay.
as well. Yeah.
And we can talk in detail separately about why it didn't work for you. If we look at 100 people on everolimus, most people benefit, but there are always some people who have very little benefit and some people who have very significant benefit. So there's variability. In the same way that we're all different with TSC, our response to treatment can also be different. But sometimes the treatment doesn't work so well, because sometimes people have too many side effects. So we've learned that if we start with a very high dose, often people get lots of side effects. So we start very low and do it very gently, a bit like Hannah does with her son's medication. So a gentle approach is number one. The second is most people show response, i.e. show shrinkage of their kidney and brain and other lesions within the first 3 months of treatment. But there are people in our studies who, even if they don't show significant response after a few months, by 6 months or 9 months or even sometimes 12 months, people start to show response. So there's a different pattern. Most people, quick response, but some people are slow responders as well. So that's just a second thought. The third is people often ask me about sirolimus versus everolimus. They're in the same class. They're both mTOR inhibitors. Sirolimus is cheaper than everolimus. And we have a little bit of evidence on sirolimus and TSC, but most of the studies we've done have been with everolimus. And so from an evidence point of view, I know much less about the impact of sirolimus on people's kidneys, brains, skin, etc., or lungs than I do on everolimus, because we now have 8, almost 10 years or so of data following people who've been on it long term in that sense. One of the big topics that was discussed a lot at the Japan conference was, can we find other targets to treat TSC? And in particular, people in the kind of kidney community and lung community are very interested in, can we find things that you can take that will then stop the thing completely from growing? Because, you know, if you start mTOR inhibitors, you have to keep on it because it's a lifelong treatment rather than a knocking it out, so to speak. Now, I think it might be fine to knock out stuff in the kidney. I'm not so sure I want to knock out too many things in my brain. So we might need to think carefully about what kinds of other treatments. But people are very interested, so there's a lot of basic science and some animal stuff that are looking at different kinds of, I showed you that picture of different proteins that try to target different proteins in the brain. But we can maybe have a separate conversation about why things did and didn't work for you, because today, for anybody who has a growing angiomyolipoma in the kidney, we recommend an mTOR inhibitor as the primary treatment. Many clinics around the world don't do surgery for SAGAs anymore at all. The Cincinnati clinic, which is the biggest clinic in the world, they haven't done SAGA surgery for many years. Many people still do, of course, epilepsy surgery for a particular indication, but taking out the tumors, people just don't do it anymore. And exactly as you've done with Ravi, many people use the topical rapamycin or topical everolimus or topical whatever the medication is inside, even before people start to develop prominent facial angiofibromas, so that you can then prevent the very prominent manifestations from coming. Just a very practical tip. You all live in a country with sun. Sometimes these facial angiofibroma can be made worse by ultraviolet light. It causes almost like a second hit on your skin and can make them come online. So for everybody with TSC, as high a factor sunblock as you can every day of your life is a really useful way to kind of keep it in check. Yeah. So we'll come on to, can we treat TAND after our little break? I'm just going to show you this picture of this beautiful woman who is Lauren Leclésio, who did most of the work on the TAND checklist with me. She was my master's and PhD student, and she did the work on the cluster work, etc. And apologies if I'm going to make you a little bit uncomfortable now, but Lauren was diagnosed with malignant melanoma last year, and she died in January this year at the age of 36, and has 2 beautiful children and a beautiful husband. And we've lost an incredibly talented person in the TSC community. But it's important for me just to acknowledge and celebrate the work that she's done with us and with you in the TSC community. She was a big champion for working with families and with parent organisations to improve the lives of people who live with TSC. And I'll, maybe we won't say it again later, but I think it just reminds us of the preciousness of life and the preciousness of time, and how, with or without TSC, we should make sure we don't waste time on silly things, and that we should prioritise the things that are important to all of us. So that's slightly sad, but I think an important thought that I'd like to leave with all of you today, and just to remember and remind us of the beautiful work that Lauren did.